Excuse me. Well, I am looking forward to this. I hope as much as you will be looking forward to. So we'll see. I have a reading that I'd like to share with you. I doubt if any of you have read this, but maybe some of you have. And let's see, what can I do? I'll read it. This is from the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Now what that means is, some of you know there were a lot of Gospels and letters having to do with the early Christian movement, having to do with Christ, that didn't make it into the Bible. Okay? And so this is one of those Gospels that didn't quite make it into the Bible, and I want to read from it a little bit. This is chapter 2 from the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which was written maybe around the year 100, maybe a little before that, I doubt it, but probably, I don't know, maybe 125, something like that. Anyway, chapter 2, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, and I will be reading from this again later. When this boy Jesus was 5 years old, he was playing at the ford of a rushing stream. He was collecting the flowing water into ponds and made the water instantly pure. He did this with a single command. He then made soft clay and shaped it into 12 sparrows. He did this on the Sabbath, and many other boys were playing with him. But when a Jew saw what Jesus was doing and playing on the Sabbath day, he immediately went off and told Joseph, Jesus' father, "See here, your boy is at the ford and has taken mud and fashioned 12 birds with it, and so has he violated the Sabbath." So Joseph went there, and as soon as he spotted him, he shouted, "Why are you doing what is not permitted on the Sabbath?" But Jesus simply clapped his hands and shouted to the sparrows, "Be off, fly away, and remember me, you who are now alive." And the sparrows took off and flew away noisily. The gospel narrative of the infancy narrative of Jesus. Anyway, there's a word in biblical scholarly language, and it's called canon, C-A-N-O-N, and no, it's not a, what do they call it, a camel. And no, it's not a big gun either. Boom, it's canon, C-A-N-O-N. It comes from a Greek word which means measuring rod. Much like a yardstick that helps standardize measurements. Yardsticks or measuring rods provide conformity, and they serve as a base for comparison. So if, for example, a person, say, in Vermont has a board in front of him or her and measures that board, and it measures to be whatever, a foot or 2 or 3 feet long, that would be the same measurement, let's say, is used in Arizona. So that particular measuring rod would be the standard that all people in the community would go by, so that they know exactly what's going on in the world of measurements, let's say. There's no guesswork. And so when it came to the composition of the books of the New Testament, scholars in the early church, over the course of about 300, almost 400 years, went about the process of trying to standardize, okay, or canonize which sacred writings or writings about Jesus or about the church or about the apostles or about miracles or about the end of the world, whatever that particular Christian theme might be, and they had many, many of them in front of them. These scholars and power brokers, frankly, in the early church, particularly in Rome, had to figure out which writings were acceptable and therefore could be included in what we now call the New Testament. And likewise, which writings about Jesus or the church or whatever Christian theme it might be, they determined were not acceptable. This means, of course, that there were accounts, and frankly, there were many accounts about Jesus and the Jesus movement in circulation relatively soon after his resurrection. And it turns out these stories went well into the 2nd century following his resurrection as well. The writings that made it into the New Testament, then, to use the word that I used, were canonized. In other words, they measured up to the standards that the scholars and the leaders in the church, again, particularly in Rome, said should be included in what we now have as our New Testament. These writings pass the standardized test of spiritual, if you will, authority. You might be interested to know, not that it, just as a case of interest, that the book of Hebrews and the book of Revelation were about the last two canonized because a lot of people thought the book of Revelation was crazy. And so that really wasn't put into the Bible until about the year 350. And Hebrews, they had problems with that too. I'm glad both are in, as a matter of fact, and think both should be in. What is interesting, however, and I think important to understand, is that it wasn't until about the year 350 that we had what you would call the Bible. So this idea that you had all these Christians, soon after the time of Jesus, reading the New Testament is simply not true. That's an anachronism. It simply didn't happen. So the idea that the New Testament somehow miraculously fell out of the heavens or miraculously was fashioned within a handful of years and in the Middle East 2,000 years ago is simply a fantasy and simply not true. What is true is that there were many, many, many writings about who Jesus was, what people thought Jesus was, what people thought the church was, what people thought God was. And it's interesting that kind of information, it's not that it's been withheld from Christians. I mean, here's a book right here, and you can buy a wonderful book called the Nag Hammadi Library that has most of all of this in it. You can read the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's out there. It's out there. It's just that people don't read this stuff. It is fascinating to read it, I might add. Anyway, so the first 3 centuries after the resurrection of Jesus Christ, almost 4 centuries, was this bubbling and boiling and thinking about and what should be acceptable and what is not acceptable. Why should this one be permitted? Why keep this one away? And so on. And it took a long time to evolve into what we know as our Bible. Now, why didn't some of these writings make it into the New Testament? Well, that's a fascinating story. It's very intriguing, and of course it's very debatable why some were let in and some were not. One said writing or book that I think was in popular circulation at the time, within 100 years after the resurrection of Jesus, is the so-called infancy gospel of Thomas.